there is a big difference between pilgrims and tourists. This was very clear to me when I visited Rome 4 years ago. And in the beginning of the trip, one of the priests that was leading us, Father Koopman, gave us this rousing pump-up speech. He said, "Men, you are not tourists. You are pilgrims. We didn't come here just to take pictures and have a good time and drink some good Italian wine, even though we did. You came here to encounter God, to find a deep spiritual experience in these holy grounds." And so, right after that, we went to St. Peter's Basilica. And right away, I realized the difference between a pilgrim and a tourist. In St. Peter's Basilica, there's a lot of beautiful art and architecture. And you might have heard of the Pietà, the beautiful sculpture of Mary holding the dead body of Jesus. You know, this is an image that especially I have seen for years in pictures, in, smaller versions, and I get to see it face to face. And so I'm standing there in awe. But meanwhile, this flow of people are just rushing by and stop for about half a second to take a picture and then keep on going. And so I realized that the tourist kind of just takes the surface level. They want to check off the boxes. Okay, I've been to Rome, I've been to this church, I've seen this piece of art, and then they take pictures just so they could tell everybody that they did something cool. But the pilgrim takes his time. The pilgrim sees the deeper spiritual meaning in everything, in the sculptures and the art. Looking at the stones of Rome and seeing the saints that have walked past, that a tourist will just see a dirty old stone. And so we could use this same dichotomy of the pilgrim and the tourist with our faith. We're tempted to be spiritual tourists, to just take the commandments of our faith at surface level, to check the boxes and to keep on moving unaffected in our lives. But the pilgrim sees the commandments and sees an endless depth of what they hold, of what they treasure, the riches that our faith has to offer, and lives those out every moment. And Jesus talks about this. In our gospel, Jesus talks about how our commandments are much deeper than what we may think. That behind these kind of basic teachings, that it applies to all of us in so many deep and profound ways. And so with eyes of faith, we can see our commandments, and we can see our faith, and not just see rules, not just see things to check off the box once a week or once a year, but to see something to cherish and love. And so, for example, the spiritual tourist will say, "I've never killed anybody, so I'm a good person. Just as long as I don't do the worst thing ever, I'm good." But the spiritual pilgrim will see that commandment and realize that it's deeper than that. That every day, one must strive to love and not to hate, to foster goodness in one's heart and not hatred and anger. And the spiritual pilgrim will realize that the commandments are not just avoiding bad things. Much more than that, the commandments are going deeper and doing good through the love of Christ. And so every day, the commandment not to kill is not just about killing, but it's about loving. And it's about in every interaction, how do we foster life and not death? And so in our faith, we need to embody this selfless kindness. Especially for everyone in the medical field, every day you're faced with patients who are struggling. And on a surface level, you could just check the boxes and say that you cared for them. But on a deeper level, did you give them a greater sense of hope, love, joy? Did you encounter them and show them Christ through your faith? Another thing the spiritual tourist might say is, well, I never cheated on my wife, so that means I'm a good spouse. I've been faithful to my husband, so we're good. But the spiritual pilgrim will look at what Jesus calls us to and say, every day I strive to lay down my life for my spouse. Every day I hope to kindle the love of marriage so that I could give my spouse my all and lead him or her to heaven. And in a more general way, we know that this commandment not to commit adultery is actually about having good relationships, having deep relationships. In our lives, do we just check off the boxes of family and everybody we encounter? Or do we strive to go deeper? Do we strive to cultivate a meaningful relationship with everyone, with our coworkers, with our parents? Another thing that the spiritual tourists will say is, all right, I made it to Mass, I did my 45 minutes in church, I'm good. I'm a good Catholic. But we know that Christ is calling us to much more than simply showing up and getting out of here. That this encounter of the Mass should be the focal point of our week. And obviously it's tempting to prioritize Saturday night or Sunday brunch and just make Sunday Mass something to zip to and hustle out of. But if this is a focal point of our week, do we prepare our hearts to come here? Do we walk in with a racing mind and a flustered heart? Do we come here fully engaged? Or do we just rifle through all the tasks that we need to get done afterward? And towards the end of Mass, do we receive the Lord and let him sink into our hearts? Do we praise the Lord's presence in us with prayer and song? Or do we just try to rush out just so that we can get out of the parking lot quicker than everybody else? And so this is what Christ is calling us to be spiritual pilgrims. This is profound because we don't need to travel halfway across the world to be a pilgrim. We don't need to go to Rome. We don't need to go to Lourdes, even though those experiences are good. But every day we're called to be pilgrims. We're called to look at the world around us and see Christ in it, see our deep faith. May we not settle for the shallowness of our commandments, but desire to dive deep into the law of the Lord, into the joy and the eternity that God offers us.